It all started on a cold and rainy night. Jorge, a night watchman, had just been hired to guard the São Gabriel Hospital, which had been shut down a few years ago. The hospital was huge, with endless corridors and rooms filled with old, rusty equipment. On his first night, Jorge was excited. He thought it would be good money for a relatively easy job. But as soon as he entered the hospital, he realized it wouldn't be that easy. The hospital's walls were covered in mold, and the smell of mold and old stuff was unbearable. But what bothered him the most was the silence. A heavy silence that seemed to compress the air. Jorge started his rounds, going from room to room, checking if everything was in order. So far, so good. But when he reached the floor of the old emergency room, he started to hear a strange noise. It was like a whisper, low and constant. He tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the wind passing through the cracks in the broken windows. But the whisper didn't stop. He followed the sound, which seemed to come from one of the operating rooms. When he opened the door, the noise stopped. The room was empty, but the air was cold, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. He decided to continue his rounds but couldn't get that sound out of his head. In the following nights, the whispers became more frequent and louder. Jorge began to feel like he wasn't alone. He saw shadows moving in the corner of his eye, but when he turned, there was no one. Things started to get worse when he found a bloody handprint on the wall of one of the corridors. He cleaned it, but the next night the mark was there again in the same place. One night, Jorge was doing his routine rounds when he heard footsteps behind him. He quickly turned, but saw no one. He kept walking, but the footsteps continued to follow him. He started to walk faster, and the footsteps also sped up. When he began to run, the footsteps became even faster, as if something was running after him. Desperate, he entered one of the rooms and locked the door. He pressed his head against the door, trying to hear if whatever it was had stopped. That's when he heard a laugh. A low, evil laugh that seemed to come from all directions. He felt his heart race and began to sweat cold. He decided it was time to get out of there. He opened the door slowly and looked down the corridor. It seemed empty. He ran to the exit, but when he reached the main door, he found it locked. He tried several times, but the door wouldn't open. Then he felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly and saw a dark figure standing in the middle of the corridor. The figure started to move towards him, and Jorge, in a panic, ran to the stairs. He climbed as fast as he could but felt the figure was right behind him. He reached the top floor with no way out and entered a random room. He locked the door and stayed there, waiting. The footsteps stopped outside, and he heard that evil laugh again. The night passed slowly, and Jorge couldn't sleep, so terrified he was. When the sun finally began to rise, he decided he wouldn't stay there another minute. He left the room carefully, went down the stairs and ran to the main door. This time, the door opened without problems, and he ran out, never to return. Jorge stayed awake for days after that night, unable to sleep properly. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadowy figure and heard the malevolent laugh echoing in his mind. He tried to tell his friends and family about what had happened, but no one believed him. They said it was just his imagination, that he was working too much and needed to rest. With no other choice, he decided to return to the hospital, but this time with a camera. He wanted to prove that he wasn't crazy, that what he saw and heard was real. He arrived at the hospital before nightfall and prepared for the longest night of his life. He mounted the camera on his uniform, adjusted the microphone, and entered the hospital again. As soon as he entered, Jorge felt the same chill as the first time. The hospital seemed even more ominous, as if it were waiting for him. He started his rounds, speaking softly to the camera, describing every detail. He passed through the emergency room, the operating rooms, and the corridor where he found the bloody handprint. Everything was quiet, but Jorge knew it was only a matter of time before things started happening. Suddenly, he heard a metallic sound, like something had fallen to the floor. He followed the sound to an equipment room. When he entered, he saw a scalpel on the floor. He picked up the scalpel and looked around, trying to understand how it had fallen. Then the door to the room slammed shut, trapping him inside. He started to sweat cold, trying to open the door, but it was stuck. That's when the laughter started again, louder and closer. Jorge felt the panic rising, but he tried to stay calm, speaking to the camera. If anyone is seeing this, I'm not crazy. There's something here with me. He finally managed to open the door and ran out. The footsteps behind him started again, but this time he was prepared. He ran to the security room, where he had installed a monitor for the camera. He sat down and started reviewing the recorded footage. What he saw made his blood run cold. In the footage, he could see the shadowy figure following him through the corridors. He could see the shadows moving and, even more terrifying, he could see the handprint appearing on the wall, as if being made by an invisible hand. The laughter echoed in the audio, and Jorge felt the panic rising again. He decided he needed to get out of there, but first he wanted to explore the top floor of the hospital, where he had never been before. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step increasing his fear. When he reached the top floor, he found a dark corridor with several locked doors. At the end of the corridor there was a different door, older and more worn. Jorge felt a strong, malevolent presence coming from that door. He opened it slowly and entered. The room was filled with old files, papers scattered everywhere. In the center of the room, there was a table with a dusty diary. Jorge picked up the diary and started reading. The pages were full of accounts from patients who said they saw things, heard voices, and felt presences. The diary ended abruptly, with a blood-stained page. It was then that Jorge realized that the hospital hadn't been shut down due to lack of resources or poor management. It had been closed because something terrible was happening there. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and Jorge saw the shadowy figure approaching. He felt the air around him grow colder, and the laughter began again, louder and more threatening. He knew he needed to get out, but he was paralyzed with fear. The figure came closer, and Jorge felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then everything went black. Days later, the police found Jorge's body in the hospital. The cameras showed only him, alone, running through the corridors. There was no shadowy figure, no laughter, nothing to corroborate his story. But those who watched the footage felt an inexplicable chill, as if something were watching from behind the lenses. The news of Jorge's death spread quickly, and many began to wonder what really happened at São Gabriel Hospital. The security company that hired him tried to cover it up, claiming Jorge had a nervous breakdown. But those who knew Jorge knew he wasn't the type to scare easily. A few days after the incident, Jorge's sister, Ana, decided to investigate on her own. She didn't believe her brother had suddenly gone crazy. She armed herself with a flashlight, a camera, and a copy of the keys she found in Jorge's apartment. Her plan was to enter the hospital during the day, when the shadows seemed less threatening. Ana entered the hospital with a racing heart. The place was even gloomier in daylight, with the sun's rays filtering through the broken windows, creating strange patterns on the moldy walls. She began following Jorge's footsteps, using his camera recordings as a guide. Each step echoed through the empty corridors, making her feel watched. When she reached the top floor, Ana found the file room where Jorge had seen the diary. The air was cold, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. She picked up the diary and started reading the last pages her brother had left open. The patient's descriptions matched what Jorge had told. They also mentioned a shadowy figure and constant whispers. Ana felt a presence behind her and quickly turned. Nothing, but the fear was real. She knew she wasn't alone. She decided to leave the room and go down the stairs, but halfway down, she heard the laugh Jorge had described. The low, malevolent laugh that seemed to come from all directions at once. She started to run, but like Jorge, the footsteps followed her. Ana entered the security room and closed the door, trying to calm down. She turned on the camera and started recording, talking about everything she had seen and heard. Then the door slowly opened, and the shadowy figure appeared in the hallway. Ana felt panic taking over, but she knew she had to get out of there. She grabbed the camera and ran for the exit. This time, the main door opened without problems, and she ran out, vowing never to return. Ana's video went viral, and many began to believe there was something truly haunting São Gabriel Hospital. the authorities closed the hospital for good, forbidding any entry. But for those who watched the video, the question remains, what really happened to Jorge and Ana? And who will be next to uncover the hospital's secrets? Thank you for watching another Dark Tales video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any scary stories. See you next time, and beware of the dark.